I never thought that a summer night in Yellowstone could become my worst nightmare until that evening when I, a park ranger with over a decade of service, found myself trapped between the living and the dead. I'm sitting here in my small, creaking cabin at the edge of the wilderness, trembling as I try to piece together the unexplainable events that have forever haunted my mind. It started with an unusually calm night shift. The forest was still, the air crisp and silent as I made my routine rounds. I'd been patrolling the rugged trails for hours when an eerie sensation began to creep over me, a feeling that something was watching me from the dense trees. I brushed it off as the overactive imagination of a tired man working the graveyard shift. But that night, the forest had its own plans. I was near old logging trail that meandered along a steep ridge when I first heard it, a distant whisper, soft as the rustling of leaves, yet laced with a sorrow that chilled my bones. "Help me," it murmured, barely audible over the wind. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, and scanned the dark silhouettes of towering pines. Nothing. No one. I started toward the voice, my flashlight piercing the black void of the forest. With every step, the sound grew more desperate, as if a soul tormented by the past was crying out from a deep well of despair. When I reached a clearing, I saw a figure standing in the middle, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes glazed and distant, her hands outstretched. She looked right through me, and then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. That encounter was just the beginning. Over the next few nights, I began experiencing strange, unexplainable occurrences that defied the laws of nature and sanity. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the periphery of my vision. I'd hear footsteps echoing on trails that were supposedly deserted. And sometimes I'd awaken to the heavy, oppressive feeling that I was not alone in the cabin. A sensation so palpable I could almost taste the dread. I remember one particularly horrifying night. I had been reviewing some old park records in the musty confines of the ranger station when the radio suddenly crackled to life. Static blared, then a voice, weak and trembling, whispered, "Help me, please." My blood ran cold as I realized it was the same voice I'd heard in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, following the desperate call. It led me to an abandoned ranger lookout deep in the forest, a structure that had been closed for years due to mysterious incidents. The door creaked open under my touch, and inside I found a journal covered in dust and despair. The entries were written by a ranger who had served decades earlier, describing the same ghostly encounter. He spoke of a tragic accident involving a young woman who had vanished without a trace, a victim of a hit and run on a rain-soaked night. The ranger's notes detailed his encounters with her spirit, a sorrowful phantom doomed to wander the park, forever seeking redemption for the injustice done to her. The final entry was a plea. "If you see her, listen to her cry for help, for her spirit is trapped between worlds." I felt compelled to honor that request. That very night, driven by equal parts dread and compassion, I found myself on that same lonely trail where I had seen her. The forest was darker than ever, the only light coming from my flickering flashlight and the pale, eerie glow of the moon. As I reached a small clearing, I heard her cry again, louder and more anguished than before. "Please, please, help me." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a wail of torment that sent shivers through my entire being. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The air turned frigid as if the very temperature of the forest had plummeted. Slowly, the spectral figure materialized once more. Her dress, stained and torn, billowed around her as if caught in an invisible storm. Her eyes, deep pools of despair, locked onto mine, and I felt an inexplicable sadness and agony radiating from her. She spoke in a voice that was both melodic and mournful. "I am Elizabeth, and I cannot rest. They wronged me, and my soul is forever trapped in this forsaken place. I need you to uncover the truth and set me free." My heart pounded as I listened, caught between horror and an overwhelming urge to help this lost spirit. I promised her I would, though I knew not how one might release a ghost from eternal torment. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with her story. I scoured old archives, interviewed locals with whispered recollections of the past, and pieced together fragments of a tragic puzzle. I discovered that Elizabeth was a young woman from a nearby town known for her kindness and beauty. One stormy night, she had been involved in a terrible accident on a narrow mountain road. The official investigation had been shrouded in mystery, Evidence had been tampered with, and many of the details lost to time. Rumors whispered of corruption, of a cover-up orchestrated by powerful figures who had much to lose if the truth emerged. Every night, her ghost returned to me, her presence growing stronger as the case reopened old wounds in the community. The more I uncovered, the more I felt as if I was being drawn into a labyrinth of secrets and supernatural forces beyond my control. I began noticing subtle signs that I was being watched, not only by Elizabeth's forlorn spirit, but by others, whose spectral presences hinted at a dark conspiracy. Mysterious figures appeared at the edge of my vision. Strange symbols were etched into the bark of trees where the accidents had occurred. It was as if the forest itself was a silent witness to the sins of the past. One evening, while examining a faded photograph in an old file, I found an image of Elizabeth standing next to a handsome man. The man's eyes, however, held a cold, calculating look. I dug deeper and learned that he was a wealthy local industrialist with extensive influence. Rumor had it he was involved in several shady dealings, and some even speculated that he had a hand in her untimely death. The truth was horrifying. Elizabeth had been silenced to protect a dark secret that had long festered in the heart of the community. As I confronted the local authorities with my findings, I was met with resistance and veiled threats. Soon, I realized that my every move was being watched. There were nights when I heard the sound of footsteps circling my cabin, and I caught fleeting glimpses of a figure in a tailored suit standing just beyond the reach of my light. It was clear that those who wanted to bury the truth were doing everything in their power to stop me. One cold, moonless night, while driving along a remote park road, my car stalled inexplicably. I tried to start it again, but the engine refused to roar back to life. The silence that followed was deafening. I stepped out into the biting cold, feeling exposed and vulnerable. That's when I saw her again, Elizabeth, standing on the side of the road, illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Her eyes pleaded silently with me, urging me to press on with my quest for justice. In that moment, I knew that if I gave up, not only would her spirit remain trapped, but more lives might be lost to the malevolent forces determined to keep her secret hidden. Determined, I pressed forward, despite the constant sense of dread and the feeling that the forest itself was conspiring against me. I began receiving anonymous warnings. Letters slipped under my door, messages scrawled in red ink, and even a hand-drawn map pointing to forgotten sites within the park. Each clue led me deeper into a web of horror and corruption, a tapestry woven with deceit, tragedy, and spectral revenge. The final breakthrough came on a stormy night, much like the one in which Elizabeth had met her tragic fate. I arrived at an abandoned boathouse by a lake that, according to local lore, was cursed. The rain hammered down in relentless sheets as I carefully stepped inside. There, hidden beneath decades of grime and decay, I found a locked safe. With trembling hands, I managed to crack it open, and inside lay documents that confirmed everything. There were records of illegal transactions, bribery, and even hints of an attempted cover-up of a fatal accident. Among the papers was a confession, a signed statement from the very industrialist I had suspected. His words were damning, exposing his role in the conspiracy that had silenced Elizabeth forever. As I held the documents, a cold wind through the boathouse, and I felt a presence envelop me. A mix of relief and sorrow. In that fleeting moment, I swear I heard Elizabeth's voice, soft and grateful, echoing in the cavernous space. "Thank you," she whispered, and I knew then that her tormented soul would finally find peace. But the victory was bittersweet. Even as the case was reopened and justice began its slow march through the legal system, the scars of that haunted summer remain etched in my memory. I now bear the burden of knowing that beneath the veneer of our beautiful national parks lie secrets so dark that even the brave few, like myself, who patrol these lands, are forever changed. Each night as I walk the trails, I can't help but feel that somewhere in the whispering winds and rustling leaves, Elizabeth's spirit lingers, a constant reminder of a past that refuses to be forgotten. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see her sad, spectral face, and I hear her final plea echoing through the trees. A cry for help from beyond the grave, a ghostly reminder that some wrongs never truly die. They merely wait for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. I tell you this not just as a warning, but as a testimony to the horrors that can reside in the hearts of men and in the forgotten souls of those who have been wronged. The park may be a sanctuary of nature, but it also serves as a graveyard for secrets, where the restless dead whisper their stories in the dead of night.
Story number 2.
I still remember that cold autumn evening as if it were yesterday, the kind of night that sends shivers down your spine even when you're well inside your own home. My name is Bill, and I've been a park ranger in the rugged backwoods of the Adirondacks for nearly 15 years. I've seen my fair share of oddities, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that fateful night. It began like any other patrol. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the forest was a riot of color under the silver light of a full moon. I was on my usual route along an old, seldom-used logging road when I noticed something strange. The road, usually empty and silent, was lined with deep, uneven footprints that didn't match any animal track I'd seen. They were large, deliberate, as if someone or something was marching in a hurry. I tried to dismiss it as the work of a stray hunter or even a wandering hiker, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. The forest itself seemed to lean in, its ancient trees casting long, menacing shadows that danced with the wind. As I drove deeper into the remote section of the park, the radio began to crackle with interference, and then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere all at once. At first, I assumed it was just the wind weaving through the branches. But as I pulled up to a clearing near an old stone monument, a relic from a forgotten era, the whispering sharpened into desperate words. Don't leave me. Don't forget me. Frozen in disbelief, I stepped out of my truck, my heart pounding louder than the hooting of an owl in the distance. I moved cautiously toward the monument, a crumbling memorial dedicated to soldiers lost in a long-ago battle during the Civil War. The plaque was worn, the names barely legible, and it was here that the forest felt most oppressive, as if the very air was thick with grief and regret. In the center of the clearing, I saw a figure, a man in tattered, old-fashioned military attire. His eyes were vacant, and his uniform, though faded and ragged, looked as if it belonged to a time when honor and sacrifice still meant something. He stood with his head bowed, almost pleading, and as soon as I approached, his eyes locked onto mine. "Please, remember me," he croaked, his voice quavering with an otherworldly sorrow. I couldn't tell if he was speaking to me or to the monument, but his gaze pierced through me as if he carried the weight of countless regrets. I hesitated, unsure if I was witnessing a ghost or a figment of my imagination, born out of loneliness in the vast wilderness. Before I could reply, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the chilly night air as silently as he had appeared. I was left alone with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I returned to my truck, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man, and what had tethered his soul to that place? The next few nights were an endless loop of terror and intrigue. Every time I patrolled near the monument, I felt his presence. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him standing silently by the trees, and other times I'd hear his plaintive whisper drifting on the wind. I began to research the history of that site. Digging through local archives and old newspapers, I discovered that during the Civil War, a battalion had indeed been ambushed in these very woods. The man I'd encountered was believed to be Captain Nathaniel Reed, a once revered officer who had lost not only his life, but also his honor due to a scandal that had tarnished his reputation posthumously. According to local lore, Reed had been a charismatic leader who fell from grace after being falsely accused of treachery. His name had been dragged through the mud by political rivals, and in the end, his body was never recovered. Some say that his spirit roams these woods, not seeking vengeance, but desperate for recognition, a plea to restore his honor and clear his name. Night after night, as I patrolled, his ghostly form became more insistent. One particularly harrowing evening, while I was charting new patrol routes, I heard a crash from behind a copse of birch trees. Grabbing my flashlight and gun, always prepared for any situation, I crept toward the noise. I found nothing but a scattering of old military equipment, rusted and long abandoned, strewn about as if by a careless hand. Yet, as I bent to inspect a tarnished medallion engraved with initials I recognized from the monument, I felt a cold breath on my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. Instead, the whisper came again, more urgent this time. Help me find the truth. That moment marked the turning point. I could no longer ignore the signs. Driven by a mix of fear and compassion, I began to meticulously document every unusual occurrence. I set up cameras around the monument, hoping to capture evidence of the spectral presence. One evening, as I reviewed the grainy footage in my cabin, I saw it. A flicker of a figure, translucent yet unmistakably there, hovering near the monument at the stroke of midnight. His eyes seemed to plead for justice, for someone to uncover the real story behind his tarnished legacy. The deeper I delved into the records, the more I uncovered. It appeared that Captain Reed had been caught in a web of deceit, orchestrated by his own superiors. Financial records and confidential correspondence suggested that funds meant for his unit had been siphoned off by higher-ranking officers, leading to a disastrous ambush that cost many lives. Reed's name was tarnished to cover up the corruption, and his death was shrouded in mystery. Every piece of evidence pointed to a deliberate, calculated betrayal, a betrayal that had cost countless lives and left his soul eternally tormented. With each new discovery, the hauntings grew more intense. The ghost of Captain Reed began appearing not only at the monument, but also in the very corridors of the park's ranger station. I'd see his reflection in the darkened windows, and sometimes in the dead of night, I'd hear the clinking of his old military accoutrements echoing down the empty hallways. My colleagues began to whisper about my experiences, some dismissing them as overactive imagination, while others admitted that they too had felt an unexplained chill or caught a fleeting glimpse of a spectral soldier. One evening, while working late in the station, I was approached by an elderly man who introduced himself as a local historian. He claimed to have known Reed's family and spoke with a reverence that belied his advanced years. Over a cup of black coffee in the cramped break room, he recounted the true story of Captain Reed. A story of loyalty, betrayal, and a final, desperate bid for redemption. According to him, Reed had never truly been a traitor. He was instead a scapegoat for a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of military command. His spirit, burdened with the injustice of his legacy, had been doomed to wander until someone would uncover the truth. Armed with this new perspective, I took it upon myself to bring the hidden story into the light. I began contacting descendants of the men who had served under Reed, piecing together accounts of bravery and honor that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies. As I compiled evidence, I felt the spectral presence of Reed become more tangible, almost as if he were guiding my every step. On nights when the wind howled like the cries of the fallen, I would find notes left in my locker, messages scrawled on the back of old maps, each one a silent reminder to keep pushing forward. Then on a bleak winter's night, I received an anonymous tip that led me to a long-forgotten bunker deep in the woods, a relic of wartime defenses repurposed by local factions long ago. With trepidation and resolve, I navigated the snow-laden trails until I reached the bunker. Inside, amidst decaying relics and dust-covered documents, I discovered a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of the military unit Reed had once commanded. The contents were shocking. A detailed account of the corruption that had led to the ambush, complete with names, dates, and undeniable evidence of the betrayal. Holding the envelope, I felt a cold, almost electric shock run through my body. In that instant, the ghost of Captain Reed materialized before me, his eyes no longer haunted but filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice resonating with both sorrow and relief. In that moment, the oppressive weight that had shrouded the forest seemed to lift ever so slightly, as if a long-standing curse had been broken. I immediately turned the evidence over to the authorities and local historians. The story of Captain Reed was finally given the attention it deserved. Although some resisted the truth, the mountain of evidence eventually forced the records to be rewritten, restoring a measure of honor to the fallen captain. Yet, even as Reed's name was slowly cleared, I knew that his spirit, along with the spirits of countless others wronged by history, would never fully vanish from these woods. Now, as I sit by the flickering light of my cabin's fireplace, I can still feel the chill of that night. The Adirondack Forest, with its ancient trees and hidden secrets, remains a place of beauty and terror, a silent witness to the passage of time and the echoes of lost souls. Every rustle of leaves, every sudden gust of wind is a reminder that history is not easily forgotten, and that sometimes the past reaches out to remind us that justice must be served, even if it comes from beyond the grave.
Story number 3.
I'll never forget the night the forest spoke to me in whispers of despair. My name is Jake, and I've served as a park ranger in the rugged, windswept expanses of the Pacific Northwest for nearly 20 years. I'd seen my share of oddities over that time, but nothing prepared me for the haunting I experienced deep in the heart of the old timberland. It was a bitterly cold evening in late November when I was dispatched to investigate unusual activity near an abandoned fire lookout tower on the outskirts of Cascade National Forest. Reports had come in from local hikers about strange lights flickering in the trees and eerie moans echoing among the pines. I was skeptical at first. A tired mind often plays tricks on itself in the dark, but as I ventured off the beaten path, the silence of the forest began to feel unnervingly sentient. The trail was rough and overgrown, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot the only sound aside from my labored breathing in the icy air. As I neared the old lookout, an unsettling feeling of being watched gripped me. The tower stood tall against the cold sky, its weathered wooden planks creaking under the relentless wind. Rumors had long swirled among the rangers about the tower being cursed, but they were dismissed as nothing more than ghost stories for newcomers. Inside the tower, dust and decay clung to every surface. I climbed the narrow, rickety stairs, each step echoing in the hollow space, until I reached the small room at the top. That's when I first noticed the journal, a leather-bound diary that seemed untouched by time, resting atop an old map of the forest. It belonged to a ranger named Samuel Carter, a man I'd heard mentioned in whispered legends of the park. His final entry, written in shaky script, told of a terrible accident and a subsequent descent into madness, as he claimed the forest had taken something from him that night. A chill ran down my spine as I read his words. He described how the tower became a beacon for lost souls and how, on a night much like this one, he heard voices calling his name from deep within the forest. Carter's tone was desperate, pleading for someone to remember the price he'd paid for duty and the dark secrets of the wilderness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. As I carefully replaced the journal, I heard what I thought was the rustle of fabric behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, only to reveal an empty room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I tried to rationalize the sound. A rat, perhaps, or the settling of the old wood? But deep down, I knew there was something more. Leaving the tower, I made my way down the steep, fog-shrouded trail, the diary's desperate tone echoing in my mind. That night, as I patrolled the forest in my truck, the radio crackled with disembodied static and a voice that sounded both distant and familiar. Remember me. The plea was mournful, laden with sorrow and regret, and it sent a shiver through my already chilled frame. I soon began to notice other signs. A set of footprints, too large and oddly shaped to be any known animal, would appear near the edge of the trail. At times, I'd catch a glimpse of a gaunt figure standing among the towering Douglas firs, its eyes empty yet pleading. My nights became filled with restless dreams of Carter's ghost and that spectral figure, their voices mingling with the rustle of the wind. Determined to uncover the truth behind these occurrences, I spent my off hours poring over local records and speaking with longtime residents. I learned that Samuel Carter had been a dedicated ranger who'd lost everything in one fateful night when a raging forest fire claimed not only his career, but his sanity. According to local lore, the fire wasn't a natural disaster. It was the result of a deliberate act, a sabotage meant to cover up a grievous injustice. Carter, distraught and guilt-ridden for failing to save lives, had taken his own life at the tower. Since then, many believed his restless spirit, along with others who'd suffered in that tragedy, wandered the forest, bound by unresolved pain. One particularly bone-chilling night, after a day of relentless searching, I found myself driving along a narrow road, winding through a section of the forest notorious for its dense fog and whispering winds. I was heading back to the ranger station when my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed, my heart pounding, as the figure turned slowly to face me. In that brief moment, I saw a gaunt face framed by tangled hair, eyes filled with an unspoken plea. The figure did not speak, but merely extended a trembling hand toward the hood of my truck. When I looked away, it had vanished into the mist. Unable to shake the encounter, I returned to the tower the next evening. I climbed back up, the air inside now thick with a sense of foreboding. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. a slow, deliberate shuffle that echoed along the wooden stairs. I froze. The beam of my flashlight landed on a translucent figure standing at the landing. It was Samuel Carter, or what was left of him, his uniform tattered and his eyes hollow with torment. "Help me. Find the truth," he murmured, his voice barely audible, filled with both sorrow and desperation. For a long, agonizing moment, time seemed to stop. I could feel his anguish seeping into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to flee, but instead I stood rooted to the spot, unable to deny the undeniable plea in his eyes. The spirit of Carter led me to an old hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the tower wall. Inside lay a bundle of letters and documents that detailed the events leading up to that infamous fire. They revealed that a powerful land developer had conspired with corrupt officials to deliberately set the blaze, hoping to clear the land for profit while masking the true cause of the disaster. Carter's desperate attempts to expose the truth had been silenced by those very forces, leaving him to bear the guilt of a tragedy he never truly caused. Armed with this damning evidence, I contacted the local authorities and historians. The subsequent investigation reopened old wounds and brought to light the sordid tale of corruption and greed. As the truth began to surface, I felt a strange calm descend over the forest, as though the restless spirits were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The voices on the wind became softer, less desperate, a fading echo of the pain that once haunted these woods. Yet even with justice on the horizon, I can never forget the faces I saw in the twilight, the sound of footsteps in the dark, or the mournful whispers of souls long past. The forest has a way of holding on to its secrets, of letting the past bleed into the present, and of reminding us that not all stories end neatly with the dawn. Every time I walk these trails now, I still catch glimpses of a spectral figure in a worn-out ranger uniform, or I hear the faint echo of a voice pleading for redemption. I have learned that some scars run too deep, and some spirits remain tied to the land until their stories are finally told. The forest, in all its ancient mystery and relentless beauty, will always hold a piece of my heart, and a reminder that the truth is sometimes hidden in the darkest corners, waiting for a brave soul to uncover it.
Story number 4.
I remember that autumn evening like a scar etched into my memory, a night when the wilderness itself seemed to whisper secrets of a past best left undisturbed. My name is Frank, and I've served as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for over 20 years. I thought I knew every trail and hidden corner of these ancient woods, but nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that would change my life forever. It was a chilly October night, the kind where the mist drapes over the trees like a shroud, and the moon hides behind heavy clouds. I was making my routine rounds near a rarely visited section of the park, a place where old-growth trees stood like silent sentinels and legends clung to the shadows. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the Silent Sentinel, a ghostly figure said to haunt the area, but I dismissed it as just another myth, a story to spook the new recruits. That night, however, the forest felt different. As I trudged along the narrow path, the crunch of leaves underfoot was accompanied by an eerie silence, broken only by the distant call of an owl. I reached a clearing where the moonlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy overhead. There, I saw it, a single ancient pine, its gnarled roots twisting over the earth like grasping fingers. Beneath the tree, the ground was disturbed, as if something had been dragged or buried. I pulled out my flashlight and knelt to inspect the area. The earth was fresh, disturbed only hours before. My instincts screamed at me that I wasn't alone. As I examined the spot, a cold gust of wind rustled through the branches, and I distinctly heard the sound of soft, measured footsteps on the dirt behind me. I whipped around, half expecting to see a stray hiker, but there was no one, only the shadows dancing under the pale light. My heart pounded as I resumed my patrol, a nagging feeling tugging at the back of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was merely the isolation of the forest playing tricks on me, yet the uneasy sensation lingered. Over the next few nights, strange occurrences became a part of my routine. I'd return from my rounds to find inexplicable marks on my vehicle's windshield, symbols carved into the wood of the ranger station, and even my radio, which usually hummed reliably, would sometimes emit garbled voices and distant murmurs. Then, on a particularly stormy night, when the winds howled like lost souls, I received an urgent call on the radio. A frantic voice reported unusual lights and figures moving near that ancient pine in the clearing. The dispatch ordered me to investigate immediately. Grabbing my gear, I drove toward the location, the heavy rain blurring the world into streaks of gray. Every mile felt as if I were being drawn into the heart of the mystery. When I arrived, the clearing was awash in eerie, phosphorescent light that I couldn't explain. The ancient pine loomed ominously, its branches creaking in the storm as if trying to tell a forgotten tale. And there, in the center of it all, was a figure draped in a tattered uniform, a ranger from another time. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and filled with a sorrow that cut through the roaring wind. He stood with his back to the tree, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if mourning something lost. My pulse thundered in my ears. I approached slowly, every instinct telling me to run, yet something compelled me to stay. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice nearly lost in the tempest. The figure slowly turned to face me, and for a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. His eyes, dark and unblinking, held a depth of regret and despair that sent chills down my spine. "I am Officer James McKenna," he said, his voice a low, echoing whisper, "and I cannot leave until the truth is known." His words were laced with a mixture of plea and warning, as if they carried the weight of decades of unspoken pain. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the encounter. I began to dig into the park's historical records, determined to uncover the story behind this spectral ranger. My search led me to old, brittle newspapers and dusty archives in the county records office. I learned that Officer McKenna had been a dedicated ranger nearly 50 years ago, a man known for his unwavering commitment to protecting these wild lands. One fateful night, during a series of mysterious disappearances in the park, McKenna had vanished without a trace. Official reports had labeled it an accident, a fatal misstep on a treacherous trail, but whispers of foul play and corruption were never silenced among the locals. The more I uncovered, the darker the truth became. McKenna had been investigating a series of illegal logging operations and a corrupt network that had infiltrated even the highest levels of park management. His relentless pursuit of justice had made him a target. One stormy night, when the forest was as wild and merciless as the secrets it held, McKenna had confronted those responsible. The confrontation turned violent, and in the chaos, he disappeared into the darkness, his body never found, his legacy shrouded in mystery. One evening, as I sat poring over these records in the solitude of my small cabin, a knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find a faded envelope, its edges worn as if it had traveled through time. Inside, I found a letter written in a meticulous hand. It was from Officer McKenna, addressed to a colleague, describing the evidence he had gathered against the conspirators and his deep fear for his life. The letter ended abruptly, a single sentence left unfinished. If only someone could. The message hit me like a bolt of lightning. McKenna's spirit had been reaching out, not for revenge, but for vindication, and to expose the truth he had uncovered. That night, I returned to the clearing beneath the ancient pine, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. The air was still, the storm having passed, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I placed the letter at the base of the tree, a silent promise to honor his memory and seek justice. As I left the clearing, the wind seemed to carry a soft murmur, almost like a sigh of relief. In the days that followed, I collaborated with local authorities and historians to piece together the full story. The evidence was damning, and soon a formal inquiry was reopened into the disappearance of Officer McKenna. The corrupt network that had once operated with impunity was slowly unmasked, and a long overdue reckoning began. But the forest never forgets. Even now, years later, as I walk the trails under a canopy of ancient trees, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a lone figure in a faded uniform standing silently by the roadside, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. The voice on the radio sometimes crackles with static, and in that noise I swear I can hear a whisper. Remember me. The ghost of Officer McKenna serves as a somber reminder that even in the heart of our most cherished wilderness, the past is never truly at rest. Every night, as I lock up the ranger station and step out into the darkness, I feel the weight of his legacy pressing upon me, a silent vow to protect the land and the truth it holds. The Great Smoky Mountains are not only a haven for wildlife and the echoes of ancient lore, but also a resting place for those who fought to preserve its sanctity. And sometimes, when the wind carries just the right note of melancholy, I can almost feel his gratitude, a spectral hand on my shoulder, urging me to continue the fight for justice.
Story number 5.
I still hear the echo of that chilling night, like a refrain I can never forget. My name is Linda, and I've been a park ranger in the vast, rugged expanse of the Sierra National Forest for nearly a decade. I'd grown accustomed to the solitude and the quiet rustling of the pines, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that crept into my life one fateful evening in early winter. It was just after dusk on a bitterly cold night when I was assigned to check on a section of the trails known for its sudden, unpredictable weather changes. The path wound through dense stands of evergreens and rugged rock outcroppings. I'd traversed that route countless times, yet that night, an unsettling silence had replaced the usual chorus of nocturnal life. As I moved deeper into the forest, the usual hum of crickets and rustling leaves gave way to an eerie quiet, a quiet that made every step feel like I was trespassing into forbidden territory. Halfway along the trail, I spotted something unusual. A weathered, leather-bound journal partially buried in the snow near an old rock formation. Curiosity overcame caution, and I picked it up. The cover was cracked with age, and inside, the entries were written in a trembling hand, recounting the harrowing experience of a lost hiker. The writer described an encounter with a spectral figure, a man with hollow eyes and a face contorted in agony, who claimed to be the ghost of a hiker who had perished in these woods decades ago. His final entry was a desperate plea for someone to find him, to help him finally rest. A shudder ran through me as I read those words. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the forest seemed to close in around me. My radio, which had been silent until then, suddenly crackled with a voice, distorted and distant, that whispered, "Help me." The message was so faint it could have been a trick of the wind, yet it resonated with a painful urgency. I decided to retrace the steps detailed in the journal. The path led to a narrow ravine where snow had long obscured the remnants of an old campsite. There, in the deep shadows, I saw a figure standing motionless by a fallen log. The figure was shrouded in mist, his features indiscernible. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming to run, but something compelled me to stay. When I drew closer, the figure faded, as if dissolving into the very air, leaving behind a trail of sorrowful energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the image of those desperate eyes. Over the following days, inexplicable events plagued my patrols. I began noticing footprints that led off the trail, odd, irregular steps that seemed too deliberate to be animal tracks. My equipment would malfunction inexplicably. Cameras captured fleeting images of a gaunt man standing in the background, and the radio continued to whisper that same forlorn plea. It was as though the forest itself was urging me onward, pushing me toward a truth that lay buried beneath layers of time and neglect. Compelled by equal parts dread and duty, I dug into the park's archival records. I learned that, over 50 years ago, a young man named Henry Dawson had vanished while hiking alone in these very woods. His disappearance had been dismissed as a tragic accident, his body never found. But as I pored over old newspaper clippings and faded police reports, it became clear that there was more to the story. Witnesses had reported a series of strange occurrences around the time of his disappearance. A cold, inexplicable fog, eerie lights flickering between the trees, and an overwhelming sense of despair. It seemed Henry's spirit had been left to wander, trapped between this world and the next, desperately trying to reach out for help. One particularly bitter night, as I was patrolling near a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen creek, I saw him again. Standing on a rocky outcrop, Henry's ghost appeared in the pale light of a full moon. His face was gaunt, eyes pleading, and his spectral form was translucent, yet unmistakably human. I called out to him, my voice trembling. "Henry? Is that you?" For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself as he slowly raised a hand in silent appeal. Then, as if a decision had been made in some distant past, he turned and began to drift away, beckoning me to follow. I followed him into a part of the forest I had never ventured into before, a secluded glen where ancient pines formed a natural cathedral. There, hidden beneath a mound of snow, was an old rusted tin box. Inside lay a set of personal belongings, a faded photograph of Henry with friends, a broken compass, and a letter addressed to any kind soul who finds this. In the letter, Henry recounted the terror he felt that night, a premonition of a danger lurking in the woods and his desperate attempts to warn others. He wrote of a malevolent force, an unseen presence that seemed to stalk him relentlessly until it claimed his life. His final words were a plea to help release him from an eternal limbo so that he, and perhaps others, might finally be free of the curse that bound the forest in sorrow. The discovery of Henry's box sent a chill deep into my core. I handed the items over to the park historian, and soon a small team was assembled to investigate the dark history of that secluded glen. What we uncovered was a tale of greed, betrayal, and a cover-up that spanned decades, a story of a logging company that had recklessly exploited these lands and of local officials who had silenced dissenters with ruthless efficiency. Henry had been one of the few who dared to speak out, and his disappearance had been engineered to bury the truth. Even as the investigation progressed, the forest continued its spectral vigil. I could feel Henry's presence with me, a constant reminder of the pain and injustice that lay hidden beneath the beauty of the wilderness. At night, when the wind whispered through the trees, I would sometimes catch a glimpse of his sorrowful eyes, urging me to remember and to never forget the darkness that can reside even in the most sacred of places. Now, as I sit here by the warmth of my cabin's fireplace, I still feel the weight of that night pressing upon me, a burden shared by all who have roamed these haunted trails. I have come to understand that the forest is more than a collection of trees and trails. It is a repository of memories, both beautiful and terrible, and sometimes the voices of those long past come calling, desperate to have their stories heard, to find solace in the light of truth.